In the NHL, star power is everything. Superstars can light up the scoreboard and bring hope to an entire franchise. So when Draisaitl signs an 8-year, $112 million deal, it feels like the ultimate win for the Edmonton Oilers. But here's the real question. Do these monster contracts actually lead to success, or are they a curse waiting to happen? This is Leon Draisaitl, and he just signed an 8-year, $112 million contract, paying him an average annual value of $14 million a season, the most in NHL history. And it's hard to argue that he doesn't deserve it. Since 2017, Draisaitl has recorded the second most points in the entire NHL, second to only his teammate, Connor McDavid. Draisaitl's contract comes in as the second largest contract in NHL history. Yes, I know I said it's the largest, but that is in terms of AAV, but not in terms of total value. Alex Ovechkin's 13-year deal he signed in 2008 comes in at $124 million. Then you have Draisaitl at $112, followed by Weber, Crosby, and Kovalchuk. The reason you're not seeing players like McKinnon or McDavid up here is because up until 2012, there was no limit on the length of a contract. That's why you saw players like DiPietro signing a 15-year deal, or Ovechkin signing a 13-year deal, or even Weber's 14-year deal. Now the maximum is just 8 years for a player resigning with their team, or 7 years if they signed in free agency. So it's good that Edmonton locked down one half of their duo, right? Well, historically, big contracts don't really work out for teams in the long run. For one, there's the issue of players dropping off or falling out of their prime during their contract, but that's not going to happen for Draisaitl. Leon is established in the NHL and he'll be a top player for a while. The real problem isn't about individual performance. It's what these mega deals do to a team's flexibility underneath the salary cap. The NHL is a league where depth wins championships, and when a huge portion of your cap space is tied up in one or two players, it becomes very difficult to build that all-important supporting cast. This is where the curse of big contracts comes in. They look great on paper, but when you're up against the cap, filling out the rest of your roster, it becomes a serious challenge. It was pretty well known that before 2023, a team with a player making more than $10 million had never won a Stanley Cup. Let's look all the way back to 2009 when the Penguins won the Cup. Their two star players, Evgeny Malkin and Sidney Crosby, were both making $8.7 million a season. Then in 2010, the Hawks were paying Kane and Taves $6.3 each. Moving into 2011, Chara was making $6.9 and Bergeron was making $5. And if we continue to look at every single Cup winner and their highest paid two players, no team had a player making more than $9.5, which we saw in 2016 and 17 with Malkin, 2018 with Ovi, and then 21 and 22 with Kuch. It was often seen as a curse paying a player $10 million because, well, no team had ever won the Cup with a player making that much. But that all changed in 2023 when the Vegas Golden Knights won it all with Jack Eichel on the roster with a $10 million cap hit. Now, you can get into how they circumvented the cap by having Mark Stone on the LTIR, but they still won the Cup with the player making $10 million, proving it's not a curse and it is possible. And the next year, the same thing happened. Florida won the Cup with not one, but two players making $10 million, Barkov and Bobrovsky. So is the curse over? Are these two Cup wins proof that with the right cap management or cap circumvention, teams can succeed even with large contracts? I guess, but it's more so the fact that the cap is rising more than it ever has. Back when the Pens won in 2009, Malkin and Crosby's $8.7 million contracts were a lot more valuable. The salary cap back then was a measly $56.7 million. If those contracts were put into today's era with the new $87.5 million salary cap, it would be equivalent to $13.4 million. Ovechkin's $9.5 in 2018 is about $11.1 now. So I think a better way of looking at contracts, especially when you're viewing them over time, is to look at the percentage of the cap that they take up. Let's look at that same graph that showed the top two players' salaries, but now replace the dollar amount with the percent of cap their contract takes up. With this, all contracts, no matter the salary cap, are essentially on the same playing field. You see Crosby and Malkin in 2009 hold the highest at 15.3% each of their team's cap space. So the 2009 Pens had 30% of their cap tied up between two players. And I mean, when it's Crosby and Malkin, how could you not? But except that team, most teams seem to have about 18 to 22% of their cap allocated to their two best players. The outliers are obviously the 2009 Pens with 30%, the 2016 and 17 Pens with 25%, and then the recent Panthers had 24%. So obviously with the cap rising, it's apparent that $10 million contracts aren't as big as it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, a $10 million contract would eat up almost 15% of the cap. And today it's still a lot, but it's more of a modest 11%. So what $10 million was 10 years ago is more like what 13 mil would be today. Going forward, we're going to see a lot more teams with $10 million players win because pretty soon enough, everyone's going to have one. So what we do have to keep an eye on is how those teams with players making $13, $14, $15 million do, and if it's even possible to build a good enough team with a single player taking out 15% of the cap. This is one of the main reasons why Toronto's cap situation is criticized so much. They have 4 of the top 12 highest contracts in the league. Matthews is making $13.25 million, which takes up 15%. Marner makes $11.5, which takes up 13%. Tavares and Nylander make around 11 each, which takes up about 12.5% each. So they have 43% of their cap tied up between 4 forwards, leaving very little room to fill out a bottom 6, a good D-core, and solid goaltenders. Everything that Toronto's been scrutinized for missing in the past. So with Draisaitl at 8.5 and McDavid at 12.5 for next season, that puts them right around 23% combined, which is fine. But when the Draisaitl extension kicks in, they're going to be pushing 30%. And then after that season when McDavid needs to be paid, it might be somewhere around 35% between just 2 players. Now, I'm not saying that they don't deserve this or it's a bad decision by the Oilers. These are 2 of the best players on the planet and you need to pay them. So they're going to have to do something very similar to the 09 Penguins, which is pay the top 2 guys whatever they want, then try their best to fill the rest of the roster with good value contracts. But it's not just about the percentage of cap taken up by top tier players. The real risk lies with these big contracts with players that aren't living up to the value of their massive deals. Take Darnell Nurse for example. He's not a terrible defender by any means, but a contract paying him over $9 million a year until 2030 is an enormous overpay. That's about 10.5% of the Oilers' cap. Money that they desperately need to round out their roster with depth and role players. These types of contracts, where a player isn't meeting the high expectations tied to their pay, are the ones that cripple teams over time. Nurse may not be the sole issue, but having that much tied up in one player who's not an elite difference maker creates a major handicap when you're trying to keep a competitive, deep roster. We've seen this play out before. Think back to Rick DiPietro, who signed a jaw-dropping 15-year deal with the Islanders, only to struggle with injuries and inconsistent play throughout his career. The Islanders are still paying him to this day. This contract became infamous, not just for its length, but for how it tied up money the franchise could have used elsewhere during a crucial rebuilding phase. More recently, there was Jonathan Huberdeau. He was coming off a very impressive 115-point season when he signed his $10.5 million deal, but after being traded to Calgary, he couldn't even crack 60 points. This is the danger with big contracts. You're betting that your star players will continue to perform at an elite level for the entirety of their deals. But if they don't, the consequences can ripple through your franchise for years. And this is where the Oilers could face a tough situation. Right now, they have McDavid and Draisaitl on relatively reasonable deals in terms of cap percentage. But when McDavid's contract comes up, likely pushing north of $15 million per year, Edmonton will need to make some hard decisions. If Nurse continues to play below the level of his massive contract, the Oilers will have to consider whether they can afford to keep him at such a high price. Otherwise, they risk limiting their flexibility to build a well-rounded roster capable of competing for a Stanley Cup. So where does that leave Edmonton? Sure, McDavid and Draisaitl are worth every penny right now, but as contracts get bigger, the margin for error becomes razor thin. It's not just about locking down your stars, it's about what happens when the rest of the team suffers because of it. And let's face it, overpaying on a guy like Darnell Nurse puts even more pressure on the front office to make all the right moves elsewhere. The Oilers are going to have to get creative. There's no way around it. If McDavid's next contract pushes $15 million and Draisaitl's close behind, Edmonton might be looking at a situation where nearly half their cap is tied up in just 2 players. That is a ton of pressure on those guys to perform at MVP level every single year, with little room for injury, slumps, or a bad season from the supporting cast. We've seen this happen across the league. Once you've committed big money to a few players, the rest of your roster can start to feel the pinch. When you've got a defenseman like Nurse making over $9 million, it doesn't leave much flexibility to add the type of depth that wins championships. That's why teams like Tampa Bay have been so successful. They spread the money around, they just don't rely on 1 or 2 guys carrying the load. Sure, they had their stars during that run with Point, Stamkos, Kucherov, but they also have a very deep bench full of players who can step up when needed. And it's that type of team building that allows you to compete year after year. And it's hard to do that when you're constantly up against the cap because of a few bloated contracts. So are the Oilers going to be able to pull all of that off? Can they keep McDavid and Draisaitl happy while still building a roster that can go the distance? Or are they just setting themselves up for a situation where they're forced to shed talent elsewhere just to keep their superstars? That's the real risk with these big deals. You tie up so much money in one or two guys, and it becomes a juggling act to stay competitive. What makes it even trickier is that the market for these contracts is only going up. Each time a player signs a massive deal, it sets the bar higher for everyone else. And the Oilers are right in the middle of that. What they do with McDavid and Draisaitl is not only going to set the tone for just their team, but for the rest of the league. Everyone's watching to see if they can keep these stars and still build a team capable of winning it all. Leon Draisaitl's contract could be the Oilers' ticket to greatness, or it could be another chapter in the curse of big contracts. Only time will tell if Edmonton can find a way to balance their stars with the depth needed to finally bring the cup back to Edmonton.